Thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to be able to introduce this panel, which could call it the Beauty and the Beast panel. I think they need no introduction, but I'll talk a little bit about them. Ladies first, Jacinta Price, you all know. Councillor Jacinta Price from Alice Springs. She's the country Liberal candidate for Lingari. I got that right? Yep. She's also, like me, a former McGregor Fellowship holder from the Centre for Independent Studies, and she's also a former researcher with the Centre for Independent Studies. And she's going to be talking a bit about, the history of economic development, but talking very much from personal experience, what she's seen, what she's lived up there in the Northern Territory. And Warren, of course, now I'll just read to you what Warren sent to me to read. Businessman, strategist, media commentator and TV host, author, and contributor to many academic and media publications, opinion writer and political advisor. What he didn't say, he's a mover and a shaker, an arse kicker, and a disruptor. That's our little secret, Warren. And between the two of them, they really have been responsible for facilitating debate, talking about the taboo topics, and boy, have they paid a price for it. Okay, they really have paid a price for it. However, one thing that keeps them going is people like you. So your support is so much needed and necessary for these two. I think I've said all I want to say. How about we give about 15 minutes each for you, and we'll have some question time at the end. We'll have Jacinta first. Oh, and Warren will be talking about the future, where we're headed in the future. Okay, Jacinta.
Wow, good morning. Thank you, Tim Andrews, for giving me the opportunity to come along and be part of this conference, and in a room full of people who aren't afraid to think for themselves and certainly to challenge one another. I feel at home. As Anthony mentioned, I'll talk a bit about, from a historical perspective within the Northern Territory, and a lot to do with my own sort of personal family experience as well on the topic of economic development. So in the Northern Territory, the first Aboriginal people to be employed were guides for explorers and cattlemen. They were employed for their skills, language and knowledge of the country. They could live off the land and knew the country intimately. In the first phase of the frontier, Aboriginal people were made quiet. Violent resistance and the spearing of stock for food were discouraged with the whip and the gun, sometimes poison. When they accepted the benefits of cooperation, often the only option available, the only way to survive once the land was taken, they quickly learned the extra skills they needed to work for pastoralists. Their ability to survive in the bush and their incredible encyclopedic knowledge of their own and their neighbours' countries made them excellent stock workers. The industry became dependent on them. The stereotypical black tracker and stockman are male. In fact, because they did most of the food gathering and hunted the small game, women were better trackers than the men. Isn't that right, fellas? Women were peacemakers of the make love, not war kind, as in the royal families of Europe. They often were offered or offered themselves as wives to the incoming strangers, these dangerous men without women and children. Because the way to make a stranger a friend rather than an enemy was to make them kin. The quickest way to make them kin was to offer them a wife. Many of the white male pioneers took Aboriginal female companions who worked for them, as they were also used to having worked for their Aboriginal husbands. Men came into the stations for work, for food, for secure water supplies, clothes and blankets. They had no experience of money. Stations supported their workers with food, clothing, and extremely basic accommodation, which the Aboriginal workers were also used to. They had always lived naked, with no permanent housing and no bedding, with all of their energy going into finding enough food and water to survive day to day. If these basic needs were met, they were prepared to work, and of course, it suited the cattlemen to not pay them in money. When they came into the missions like Hermannsburg, if they were able-bodied, they were expected to work for their food and accommodation. The missionaries did not want them to become dependent and lose the skills they had used to survive for tens of millennia. Missionaries put a lot of effort into making them economically independent. Now, my grandparents worked all of their lives. They were children when they first set eyes on white men. My grandmother was one of those young women, Aboriginal women, who did stock work on cattle stations and was permanently injured after she'd been thrown from a horse. Her father worked all over Central Australia and beyond putting in bores, and she travelled with him as a child. My grandfather was a refugee from the Coniston Massacre of 1928, which killed around 100 men, women and children, according to Aboriginal witnesses. He had to travel in a hurry to escape the killers. He was only 14 at that time. By the early 30s, he was working on the stations, missions and mining fields. He saved money, enough to pay a bride price, £10 worth of store-bought goods for my grandmother to her promised husband. Certainly a romantic, wasn't he? He carried the mail by camel, drove cattle into Queensland, dug wool from ore, helped build houses and anything he could to make a living. After spearing a couple of goats, he was taken by police in chains, along with many others, to Alice Springs to work as a labourer for the Army in 1942. In that year, he turned 28. Although he was only paid 5 and later 10 shillings a week, when a white man could earn £5, which was 20 times more, for the same work, he was proud of the work he did and learned a great deal from the experience. In 1954, those called half-castes gained the right to apply for full citizenship if they agreed not to stay in contact with full-bloods. My full-blood grandparents and my mother were still legally wards of the state until the relevant ordinance was repealed in 1964. Of course, after a while, Aboriginal workers started to understand the uses of money and wanted what they saw was due to them. When equal pay came in 1968, around a third of the Aboriginal workforce lost their jobs and were forced off stations, off their country, to live as fringe dwellers in towns or at the new government settlements like Yuendumu, where my family are from, with no work and no income. The pastoralists argued that they couldn't afford to pay award wages and also support dozens of dependents at the same time. The wool industry in the Kimberley and Pilbara collapsed altogether. Aboriginal workers were never consulted about the decision, and missionaries and unions spoke in court on their behalf. It was a good idea, very badly implemented, with very mixed results. I'd never argue against equal pay. Obviously, who would? But I certainly do maintain that it could have been done better and without causing an economic disaster. We're still dealing with the fallout from that disaster. My mother was born in 1960. She tells me that in the welfare era, which was the time of protection by missionaries, that is now roundly condemned, of course, that everybody in her community of Yuendumu worked. Everybody ate well and were much fitter and healthier than what they are now. Sometimes something went terribly wrong. Millions, if not billions, have been spent on education, training programs, job creation schemes, and so on, but little seems to be improving. In education, so much energy has been put in preserving culture and language. Not that that's a bad thing in itself, but nowhere near enough has been put into teaching our national language and the skills needed to join in and benefit from the national economy. Another good idea implemented badly. We now have generations of kids in remote communities who do not speak standard English, let alone read and write it. Aboriginal Australians are linguistically very talented. My mother speaks, reads and writes Warlpiri, her first language, and English fluently, and speaks 3 other Aboriginal languages. She was taught English before the bilingual program at her school. The problem is definitely not lack of talent and intelligence. We now have a couple of generations of Aboriginal teachers and health workers who can't function at all outside their own communities and can't do their jobs independently even within their own communities. This has been the result of decades of culturally appropriate two-way education badly done. We should have been able to preserve languages and pride in identity while teaching competence in English and mathematics at the same time. We've also not addressed the elements of traditional culture that militate against the ability to benefit from the mainstream economy. A very obvious one to me is the demand share economy. I've had to live with this and cope with it all my life. You can't say no to kin. They have open access to all of your assets and income under the old rules. That is the only way my people could survive in the desert for tens of millennia. You'd have to share to survive. The only thing they possessed that could be shared was food, water, and maybe firewood. Now in the cash economy, it is a disaster. If you're obliged to give with no questions asked, you can't budget, you can't save, and you can't invest. This strips away your incentive to work in the first place. Some of your kin will be addicted to substances or behaviours that aren't good for them: alcohol, drugs and gambling. When I've attempted to highlight the detrimental impacts of the demand share economy to a wider Australian audience, the response from the left has either been disbelief or defensiveness for a system unknown to those defending it. Life is tough and stressful. Death and disease are always present. There is great pressure on individuals to do that which makes them feel good in the short term. If you're addicted to something and the rules allow you to demand that your kin fund your addiction, then you are not doing them or yourself, and most definitely your kids, any good. I believe this is one of the greatest deterrents for Aboriginal people to participate in a modern economy. It is well understood amongst Aboriginal people that when it is payday, you make yourself scarce, as family will be looking for you to demand access to your pay. The ABC program Black Comedy even pokes fun at this fact. They acknowledge its existence. So it is ridiculous to argue that this aspect of culture does not play a significant role in discouraging Aboriginal people from employment. This problem can only be overcome with cultural reform, but detractors would argue this is assimilation, which is nothing more than a trigger word that leads to no solution. Instead, the practical view that needs to be taken is that culture has always evolved based on the circumstances of the time to ensure survival. If we don't change our culture in practical terms, we will not survive. So the education system has not done what it should have done. It has failed the most marginalised, it could be said. And the old rules will not give the most marginalised the tools they need to deal with contemporary problems. Those that the old ones, the elders past, could not even have dreamt of. Ironically, those Aboriginal people who were not given choices, who have lost their traditional culture and their language, are the ones that have done best out of the education system and are now doing well out of the economy. Those in remote communities can learn from them. They need to feel that the solutions they come up with are genuine Aboriginal solutions and not imposed on them by white men. When it comes to employment, we need to fix education, teach what is needed to succeed. When it comes to culture, people should be encouraged to adapt. They need to find solutions to new problems. In the words of the Iban Indigenous Senior Minister in the Sarawak State Government of Malaysia, Dr. James Massing, whose near ancestors were headhunters, if you don't change, you die. That is what is happening to my people now. They are not able to change fast enough, so they are dying, and the world is telling them, don't change, while others following their own agendas blame their own white ideological and political enemies for their dying, never suggesting that Aboriginal people themselves can take responsibility for their own survival. This last week, I've been helping my 33-year-old niece to cope with end-stage renal failure and her 11-year-old daughter to attend an ongoing battle with rheumatic fever. We have the highest rates of that in the world. Their mother, my sister-in-law, in her 40s, walks with a limp and has permanent damage to her sight and hearing resulting from assaults by Aboriginal male partners and an Aboriginal stranger who attacked her because she had no grog or cigarettes to give him. None of them have the English skills, confidence or competence to deal with the wider world effectively. The number of avoidable deaths, illnesses and injuries we have witnessed amongst those close to us seem countless. The way out of this disastrous situation is real and meaningful work in the real economy. We have to get serious about it. First, we could pay people for their traditional skills, as the old pastoralists used to do. The various ranger programs in remote areas are now doing that. People can be paid to continue traditional fire management regimes, for example. They can use their traditional tracking and bush skills brilliantly for projects like the New Haven Conservation Project in Warlpiri country. But there are nowhere near enough jobs available through that channel. On the most remote communities, the jobs are publicly funded. That can't continue. Aboriginal organisations and government agencies should be prepared to work more cooperatively with the industries that create jobs in the bush, that already exist, instead of treating them as enemies. I've personally found much goodwill amongst the pastoralists that I know in Central Australia. Many of them have grown up with Aboriginal people and learned much from that contact. They tend to be, well, not politically correct and have an earthy sense of humour, just like Aboriginal people. They are also pragmatic and commercially hard-headed. They know the country and they know what they are doing. Many are genuinely sympathetic in regard to the disasters facing the Aboriginal people they grew up with, and I see great potential there. The mining industry has had a very good track record in overall Indigenous employment, but is not so good at employing the residents of local, remote communities on a permanent basis. But neither is anybody else, including, paradoxically, local Aboriginal organisations. You never see people from remote communities whose first language is not English in management positions in these organisations. You will notice that when the land councils face the media, it is the town-based English-speaking CEO facing the camera, not the elected Indigenous language-speaking chairman from a remote community. If people are given an opportunity to work in an area where they feel competent and confident, they will take that opportunity. The problem is to give them the means to feel competent and confident, then supporting them to be able to culturally adapt so that that which gives them their sense of pride in who they are, their sense of identity and spiritual fulfilment, does not prevent them from taking advantage of what the economy has to offer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. What you said was just great. And you never read about that in The Conversation or The Guardian. So, you always get a corrupted, sanitised version there. And when Jacinta's talking about caring for sick relatives, she's known nothing different since you were born. Just sick, looking after sick people, stab wounds, broken bones, diseases which none of us are ever going to get. It's just regular and normal for her. our next speaker, Warren. I should say to Jacinta, you may have seen her husband on The Voice, Colin Lilly, recently. So our next speaker, Warren. And Warren is a great challenger. I mean, he's challenged my ideas, things which I thought were set in stone, and he's tactfully, he presents an argument and I say, oh, yeah, okay, mate, I didn't know that. Thank you so much. So we're all going to be challenged by what Warren's going to say, and I'm sure, like Jacinta, he'll bust a few myths.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for those kind words. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the introduction it was $170 billion was the cost to the economy in regard to regulations. Is that correct? I'm just looking around. The number quoted. Okay, yeah, it's correct. And that was the number quoted. And I just wanted to start off by saying that people may know the James Price Point gas hub in the Kimberleys, which was the Aboriginal community there agreed to work with the Woodside to construct, but was finally determined to be uneconomic because of the Green campaign against it. Just on the EIS, and this was that they informed me, was $1 billion was spent on the environmental impact statement, just to determine. So you wonder why things, regulations really start changing things in regard to economic development of Australia. First of all, I'd like to thank the Australian Libertarian Society and Tim Andrews and the team for inviting me to speak here today for the 6th Annual Friedman Conference. The conference today is named after the Friedman family, Milton, his wife Rose and son David, all free market economists, and grandson Patrick, a libertarian political activist. There is also a daughter Jane, who is a champion bridge player. I guess there's an odd person in everyone's family, but anyway. Outside today there are copies of my memoirs for sale at a very reasonable price, and depending on your circumstances may even be tax deductible. So I suggest you try and get as much tax deductibility as possible. I'm happy to sign copies of that during the lunch break and also the morning tea. Besides being wanting to sell my book, the other reason why I mention that is the book tells the story of my family, starting way back in the early 1800s when the Bundjalung people, my father's people, had first contact with the white pastoralists as they made their way up into northern New South Wales. I was the 9th of 11 children. I was born in Runnymede Hospital in a segregated wing for Indigenous mothers and babies. For the first 11 years of my life, probably 13 years of my life, I lived under the Aborigines Protection Act of New South Wales. This imposed segregation on Indigenous people in New South Wales, which is administered by the Aborigines Welfare Board. Similar regimes existed across Australia. It was these laws that enable authorities to remove Indigenous children and to put older children into service. That's my father's dog tags, or as they call them, a certificate of exemption. In New South Wales, we were banned from being out after 5 p.m. This is my father's certificate of exemption, which we used to call a dog tag, which gave him an exemption from these rules. He got it so he could travel freely to and from work after he once got arrested coming home from work. But then most Indigenous people lived on missions and reserves and under the complete control of government. One thing that made a difference for my family, however, was that we didn't live on missions or reserves. The Mundines, my father's family, had their own land, a small plot about 100 kilometres north of Grafton up the Clarence Valley called Bayugal. It was given to them by the local cattle station owner, and they fiercely guarded that independence. My mother's parents had bought their own home in the late 1800s, and my parents bought their first home in South Grafton in 1947. When we moved down to Sydney, they sold it and bought a house in Auburn in the western suburbs of Sydney. So I grew up in a family that were homeowners and land owners. That gave you some leeway to dodge some of the controls of the welfare board if you had your wits about you. There were some funny stories about that in my book. I also grew up in a family where everyone worked. Back then, this was normal. All Indigenous people worked. They were all working as cattle owners, rural workers, and also in many other jobs as well, in the rail lines across New South Wales. The current problems we see with chronic intergenerational welfare dependence come later. When Aboriginal people were first moved into welfare in the early 1970s, the elders come up with the expression sit-down money to describe it. They couldn't believe government were going to pay people to do nothing. Most of these men, and they were men and women, they worked on drovers runs, they worked in shearing sheds, they worked as fruit pickers, they worked as asparagus workers, they worked as people across the entirety of Australia. And they worked very hard. These were hard, tough people. They just could not believe that someone would get paid for doing nothing. Owning your own home, a job, these are the most fundamental means of human economic participation. Lack of economic participation is at the root of the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians across the board, including in health, life expectancy, incarceration, and even kids in out-of-home care. Recently, the President of the Australian Medical Association, Dr. Michael Gannon, tweeted in response to one of my articles saying, "There's no question access to jobs and the economy will improve Indigenous health." He said unemployment is a huge Indigenous health issue. I've interviewed him on my program, Mundine Means Business, about the economic determinations of health. He said, disadvantage, whether it be in education or in health or in employment, they're all linked to each other. It's a wicked cycle and we should try to break into it at any point we possibly can. Economic participation is the only way to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I say that again. Economic participation is the only way to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In the early 1980s, I studied at the South Australian Institute of Technology at the Elton Mayo School of Management, where I was introduced to a whole range of new ideas, and that included the writings of Milton Friedman. I read about his ideas about the free market and minimum government intervention and individualism, and his criticism of the idea of John Maynard Keynes, that government programs and spending create prosperity and jobs. I thought some of Friedman's ideas were clever, but wasn't convinced the free market offered all the solutions. I was more of a Keynesian and thought these solutions needed to be driven by community and government rather than individuals. And that's sort of my cultural background as an Aboriginal as well. Within 10 years, I completely changed my mind. I realised Milton Friedman was correct after all. So what changed for me in that time? A few years after graduating from SAIT, I moved to Armidale. In Sydney, most Indigenous people I knew worked, some had attained high levels of education, and many were buying their own homes. But when I moved back to regional New South Wales, I come across Indigenous communities where people didn't work at all. And I was shocked to see this pattern all over rural and regional areas of the state. This is not how it was when my family left South Grafton in the mid-1960s. Things had gotten worse. Indigenous people were still living in poverty, but they were no longer working. Schooling was open and available with no segregation, but Indigenous kids weren't going. People were surviving off government handouts and welfare. And because they weren't working or getting educated, I could see they were being trapped in government dependency. I could also see that the land rights which we just won after such a hard battle were not going to solve these problems on their own. This completely reshaped my thinking, my thoughts about land as a basis for Indigenous advancement. If It was the first few years of the new land rights system in New South Wales, and problems had begun appearing in relationship to use of funds and governance. The vast majority of the problems were due to inexperience and lack of capacity. Most of the people running the land councils had no private sector experience. They come out of the government or community sectors, or in a lot of cases had never worked at all. I realised that it wasn't enough to have land. We needed to be capable and prepared for what comes after that. Indigenous people needed to build skills and experience in the private sector, in business, in running an enterprise, and government couldn't do this for us. The Indigenous activists didn't have an answer for all this. I had conversations with my sister, Kay, at the time about some of the so-called radicals who talk so tough about things like Indigenous sovereignty, but had never earned a cent that didn't come from a government body. My sister told me, they sit around talking about the revolution, but the next thing they'll be asking is, where is the government form to apply for a government grant to buy the guns? I read Milton Friedman again in Armidale, and finally I got what he was saying. I understood the limitations he saw with community and government-led solutions. I also come to understand his comment that one of the greatest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. Judging programs by intentions and not results pretty much sums up the last 50 years of Indigenous affairs policy. There has been a slow but steady pivot in Indigenous affairs policy over the last decade from a welfare-centric approach to an economic-central approach. It started with Indigenous leaders speaking out for welfare reform, then an increasing focus on getting Indigenous people into jobs, which Andrew Forrest really fired up. And more recently, we've seen a big focus on Indigenous-owned businesses. In fact, I attended a conference this week called Connect, which had 900 Indigenous businesses there talking about how they could drive their communities, themselves and their families forward for economic development. I have a TV show on Sky News Australia called Mundine Men Business, where I feature Indigenous-owned businesses across the country. We're in a break at the moment preparing for the next season. But when I first pitched the idea to sponsors, someone asked me whether I thought there would be enough material. There was plenty. In fact, I probably could do the next 20 years of it. There are a huge number of Indigenous people out there who are running businesses and starting businesses. People watch my show and are surprised. They never realise. There are two reasons why I am passionate about Indigenous people being in business. The first reason is because I see it as critical for Indigenous economic participation. Now, a lot of people think business is nice to have when it comes to Indigenous people, but not a first order priority. They figure business and entrepreneurship is hard enough for most people, let alone someone who has been on welfare or never worked or has many barriers to employment. They think surely it's better to just focus on getting people into a job. We need to focus on both, and there's some important reasons why. Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in remote, very remote and regional areas, and unrepresented in major cities compared to other Australians. Over 2/3 of non-Indigenous Australians live in major cities compared to just over 1/3 of Indigenous Australians. And although less than 15% of Indigenous people live in very remote areas, they make up around 45% of the population there. Indigenous people in remote and regional areas are the poorest and have the least economic participation. There's actually another gap developing, the gap in economic and social indicators between Indigenous people who live in the cities and those who live everywhere else. In remote and regional areas, job seekers can't always rely on there being an employer offering a permanent or full-time job. But if they can identify work from which they can generate an income, then they can set themselves up as a sole trader or a small business to do it and earn an income. Another factor is that small businesses are more likely to be located in regional areas than larger businesses, and small businesses is a key employer in regional Australia. In fact, something over 80% of people employed are in small business. New small businesses will in turn create new jobs. Indigenous-owned businesses also generally have higher rates of Indigenous employment. Therefore, a new Indigenous-owned small business will, in turn, likely create more jobs for Indigenous people. Lastly, in very remote Indigenous community, there is currently no real economy. People say there's no jobs in these places, but that's not true. There are jobs, and they're almost always done by non-Indigenous people from outside the community. Likewise, most of the services provided by non-locals. In fact, I spend 7 to 14 days a month travelling in rural and remote Australia, looking at these communities. I went to the APY lands last year, which is the northwest corner of South Australia, bordering on the Northern Territory. There's a tiny town right next to the APY lands border called Marla. Some people might know it, some people may not. That sits on the road from Adelaide to Darwin. According to the last census, Marla had a population of 100 people. It has a motel, a supermarket and a pub, and an electrical business. The reason I know it has an electrical business is because that business services all the towns on the APY lands, including the ones that are several hours away. The APY lands are home to nearly 3,000 people. Most of their goods and services are provided by outside businesses, including from as far away as Alice Springs, even Adelaide, at much higher cost. You don't even have to have read Milton Friedman to appreciate the problem here isn't caused by market forces. The problem is an absence of them. There is no free market economy in the APY lands. This is the problem both of the legal structures that exist and the mindsets that develops in people who spent decades outside the real economy. And like so many Indigenous controlled lands, the land is community owned. These are problems I want to see fixed, and gradually it is starting to happen. Local Indigenous people in remote Australia who set themselves up as a sole trader or a small business can provide services to their communities and will have a reliable initial income stream to kick-start their businesses. The individual towns may be small, but there are tiny homeland communities even smaller than Marla, but in a region there will be several thousand people, and businesses operating in that region can service the whole area. People in the country are used to driving long distance, and this isn't a barrier to work. And I'll give an example. I lived in Dubbo. I was the Deputy Mayor of Dubbo for a while on the Dubbo City Council for 11 years. That's a city of about 40,000 people. Even the businesses in Dubbo travel. They travel to Sydney, they travel all around the region, they travel even internationally to get businesses, to get income, for things to happen. If you look at the history of the world, you will see that real economies aren't created by governments or by communities. They are created by individuals who figure out ways to support themselves by supplying something to someone else, something the other person values enough to pay for. Every city in Australia started out as a remote community with no jobs. As I observed in the Australian once, the newspaper, when Arthur Phillip sailed into Sydney Cove in 1788, he didn't say, there's no jobs here, let's all go home. Maybe my ancestors wished he did, but he didn't. He built a colony, which became a town, which became a city, which became an internationally recognised city, which built a nation. Governments and community organisations are certainly have a role to play. For one thing, they are the ones that pay for most of the services provided in these areas at present. They can help kickstart new businesses by awarding these service contracts to locals and locally owned businesses, and you can go from there. The second reason I'm passionate about Indigenous people being in business is because I believe Australia needs to grow its regions. We need cities to grow in the bush, and we won't do that without Indigenous economic participation. There it is there. The photo on the left and behind me, I think, yep, the left and the right, I'm in the centre. On the left and right here is a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula at night. It shows South Korea lit up and North Korea pitch black. It's a sign of the complete lack of economic activity under the communist north. Now, if you Google a satellite image of Australia at night, you will find an equally stark image. A sliver of light, which is the one the further out, hugging the southeastern corners, and a cluster of light in the southwest. And the rest of our country, dark, like North Korea. That's the photo on the right. Although Australia is an enormous country by land mass, our population is heavily concentrated on the narrow strips of land along the eastern and southern coasts. And within these narrow strips, most Australians live in only a few cities. Nearly half of all Australians live in just 3 cities, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Include Perth and you have 55% of the population. Compare this to the United States, where the 4 largest metropolitan areas, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago and Dallas, are home to just 15% of the US population. 2/3 of all Australians live in just 8 places. In the United States, 2/3 of the population are spread across 100 US cities and towns. The concentration of Australia's population impacts Australia's economic strength. It's one of the reasons housing is so expensive in Sydney, Melbourne and increasingly Brisbane. It's why there is a fierce argument going on about immigration and not going on, because only the brave politicians are prepared to discuss it. Go out to Western Sydney and talk to some real people. Even better, go during peak hour and catch the train or try and drive down the road, and you won't be in doubt that this city is bursting at its seams. It's all very well to tell young Australians who want to buy a house or new immigrants to go to regional Australia. Not everyone can find work there, because most job creations in Australia is concentrated too. Half of all jobs growth is within 2 kilometres of Melbourne and Sydney's CBD. Regional development is essential to building an economically strong nation where home ownership and job opportunities are readily accessible to young people. Building our region is also essential to our engagement with Asia. China has 1 billion people, including an exploding middle class. There's large and increasing demand in China for food growth and pastures in Australia. They trust us. That trust comes from clean soil, clean water and clean air, and this is just one example. There's huge unlocked potential in Australia's agricultural and fishing industries from our regions. Australia lives on the doorstep of the fastest growing, most highly populated regions in the world, but our population has its back turned to it, huddled on the other side of the continent to Asia. Regional Australia won't develop unless we unlock the potential that exists on our Indigenous lands and within Indigenous communities. Australia's Indigenous population resembles that of emerging economies. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has projected that the Indigenous population will increase to nearly 1 million people by 2026, at an average growth rate of 2.0 to 2.3% each year. Indigenous population growth is not far short of the population growth of Nigeria. By contrast, the Australian population overall is projected to grow at 1.5 and 1.8% each year over the same period, which includes growth from immigration. The Indigenous population pyramid resembles that of emerging economies, wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. The median age of Indigenous people is 23 years old. In other words, half our population is under the age of 24. For other Australians, it's 38. I always love to say this: as the Indigenous population gets younger and sexier, the rest of the country gets older and greyer. I like the sexy bit. And in discussions about Northern Australia, Australian development, we always hear about the need to increase the population there. The final report of the Australian Parliamentary Joint Select Committee on Northern Australia, released in 2014, said we must find ways to build the population up north to realise the opportunities. Within 6 months of that report, there was a big political blow-up when some politicians suggested remote communities should be closed and Indigenous people should be moved to cities and large towns. So politicians say more people must move north to enable development. Then they say there isn't any jobs in remote areas and communities should be closed. How can there be a shortage of labour but also a shortage of jobs? By 2040, it's projected that half of the population in North Australia will be Indigenous. Yet people are scratching their heads saying, how can we encourage people to move north? It's like Indigenous people are invisible. The other reason Indigenous people are critical to regional development is that Indigenous people have recognised interest over nearly 3/4 of Australia's landmass, most of which is in the largely undeveloped areas of Australia. These areas that are black in that satellite photo I talked about earlier. Anyone doing business in these lands, be it mining or agriculture or cattle or fishing or anything else, you need to sit down and talk to Indigenous people. And increasingly businesses are. They are also partnering with Indigenous people to help them develop their lands and create jobs and small business opportunities. I spent most of my life highlighting and fighting the problems that hold Indigenous people back. I don't believe that it's racism or British colonisation or wrongdoings of the past that hold Indigenous people and communities back today. It did once, but not anymore. What holds us back today is lack of economic participation. We need less revolutionary talk and more Milton Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and what a great way to start this conference. Because we're out of time, I might just have them make one comment each.
Can we do one question?
Yeah. Oh, okay. From the yeah. No, look. I'll just ask a question now. First of all, there are some questions that have come through on the app, so if you could try and answer those, it'd be good. But I'm just going to ask one question, a general one. Given that the two of you are supposed to be suffering from transgenerational trauma and all that sort of thing, you're not. Why is that? If you can just, for 1 minute, give a response to that, why you're not suffering from it.
Is this on?
Microphones, please.
Is it on? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so why you're not suffering and how it is you've been able to thrive.
Well, because I only can talk of my own family situation, which
So about a minute, Warren.
Okay, yeah, which is 30 seconds. Okay, is that we and my family took the attitude of we're not going to be victims, that we were going to be contributors, that we were going to build ourselves, get skills and education to get jobs and to run businesses and that. And I'll be very quick on this. It started with my grandfather got a job as a cattleman on a cattle station, Yangapi cattle station up in northern New South Wales. My father and his siblings grew up thinking that was normal. He went to work and he brought his money home to my grandmother. My father then went to school and went to work. He brought his money home to my mother. I learnt that was all normal stuff. So I went to school, got a job, brought some of my money home to my wife, but that's all quiet. And then built myself into a business. My children grew up thinking that was normal. All three of my sons have got their own businesses, and they're tradies, and they do quite well. And the next generation will be the same. And so this is what it is about. It's about that if we're going to make a change, we have to do it through setting up businesses. One of the secrets of the world is you can't have a job unless your business is there making profits and making money and then employing people. Very simple thing. And that we need to break the welfare cycle and move away from governments. Well, I'm a very proud Aboriginal person. Also on my mother's side, they've got Irish background as well, so that explains my drinking habit. But we were very determined not to be victims. We were very determined to make our own life and be self-determining.
Thank you, Warren. Jacinta.
Thanks, Anthony. Look, my grandparents worked, as you all just learnt from what I've talked about. My grandparents always worked. If they had any of the kind of whingy, whiny, poor bugger me attitude back then, living off the land, they simply wouldn't have survived. They wouldn't have lived. They would have died. It's as simple as that. That attitude, of course, is carried on. It's a natural human thing to be able to work for oneself to ensure your survival. We've only come up against it now because we've experienced welfare, because we live in a very affluent society where we can whinge about things that don't actually exist. But look, my mother's worked all her life. She's never taken a welfare payment at any time in her life. And my whitefellow father from Newcastle, he had the same attitude, to take welfare payment when he was growing up was seen as a very shameful thing to do. So I've lived my life understanding I am a citizen of the world. I belong to the world. I am a human being. The fact that I'm Aboriginal doesn't completely define me. I am made up of many different backgrounds, and that's what I've grown up understanding. This victim mentality is a contemporary thing, a contemporary issue, and I'd like to think that from what my ancestors lived through and what they've survived through is where I draw strength from. It's not made me a victim.
Thank you, Jacinta. Now, just hold it for a minute. Before we properly show our appreciation collectively shortly, I'll just show our appreciation in another way. I've got some gifts for them. So for Jacinta, who I think of as a little sister, a younger sister, and for Warren, whom I think of as an older father.